Oh, sorry, I've been staring at nothing for 20 minutes and forgot it's time to record. Doesn't matter whether you call it Alcatraz, The Rock, Hellcatraz, or even just by its full name. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary is hard not to associate it with this extremely apparent reputation it has as a inescapable island fortress reserved for the only most infamous of hardened criminals. Now that reputation is true to an extent, but not inherently 100% correct. Obviously, Hollywood has substantially played up the grisly natures of the going-on, but also, I'm actually calling into question the word inescapable in that, as that's been questioned on a number of times. In fact, in the 29 years of operation, that has been questioned on a total of 14 times, and we're going to run through them all. That's right, it's going to be a long video. Welcome to Interesting History. So we're going to make this easy on ourselves and just go chronologically. We're not going to delve too deep, just add enough context to keep things interesting. That being said, let's start already. You never forget your first, so let's look at the first officially recognized escape attempt. Taking place on the 27th of April 1936, 39-year-old inmate Joseph Bowers started climbing over the fence around the edge of the island, continuing to climb despite guards' orders to come down. He was shot by a correctional officer, causing him to fall off the opposite side of the fence, crashing to the shore below. He would die of his injuries. Now, it actually very much depends on who you ask whether this should be considered a genuine escape attempt, as it's been logged as such, it's been logged as a suicide attempt, or even just a simple attempt to grab a piece of garbage out of the fence. No matter what it was, he was unsuccessful. The next attempt, which should absolutely be considered an attempt, took place on December 16, 1937, and was committed by a pair of convicted bank robbers, Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe. The part had, over time, filed through some of the iron bars on one of the windows, as well as 3 heavy panes of glass. There was a heavy, dense fog that day, so the pair made their move. At some point, between 1 to 1:30 p.m., they were able to slip away from the group, climb through the window, and used a stolen wrench to force open the gate lock, descending to the beach below, where they vanished. There was a bad storm that day, and the currents were violent and cold. To this day, neither body has ever been discovered, but it's widely assumed they were swept out to sea and are listed as missing but presumed dead. That being said, I actually had a chance to go to Alcatraz personally over the past few months and visit Alcatraz Island. I was there on a good day, and the currents were violent and cold, so I feel pretty confident in sharing with the opinion they probably didn't make it. But let's continue. On May 23, 1938, Thomas Limerick, Rufus Franklin, and Jimmy Lucas jumped and assaulted Custodial Officer Royal Klein, originally planning to seize a police boat and leave the island. However, once they reached the roof, an armed guard shot Thomas and Rufus and took the trio into custody. The officer died of his injuries, as did Thomas Limerick. Jimmy Lucas, as well as Rufus Franklin, were tried and convicted of the murder of Royal Klein and sentenced to life imprisonment. The next attempt would be on January 13, 1939, where 5 prisoners managed to gather the resources to saw through and bend the iron bars, keeping them in the isolation unit. They managed to make it out of the prison and onto the shore below, where they attempted to construct a raft to ride to freedom. Before they were able to complete it, however, they were found by correctional officers. 3 of the prisoners, Henry Young, William Martin, and Rufus McCain, all surrendered without incident. However, the other two, Dale Stampill and Arthur Doc Barker, resisted and were met with gunfire, the latter dying of his injuries. All surviving prisoners of the incident were sent to solitary confinement for their trouble. It would take more than 2 years for the next attempt to come to fruition, but on May 21st, Arnold Kyle and his brother-in-law, Joe Kretzer, hatched a plan to use an emery wheel on the mat shop window bars, break out, and bolt to Joe's wife, who would be in a speedboat by the shore. Joining them would be Floyd Barkdahl and Sam Shockley. After capturing/taking hostage several officials and attempting to break the bars on the window, no progress was being made, and with Miss Kretzer being picked up by police before she could get out to the bay, no boat was coming. The captured officials were able to reason with the prisoners, with no escape in sight, surrendering without violence. However, we're going to run into two of these guys a little bit later. A few months later, on September 15th, 1941, convicted bank robber John Bayliss would call his shot. While on garbage detail, he was able to sneak away to the shore and into the freezing water. It quickly became apparent that if he attempted to swim to shore, he wouldn't make it, and guards were able to pull him out before hypothermia could do its damage. John would also attempt to escape when he was taken to court for the attempt, bolting immediately. He was obviously caught and sentenced an extra 5 years for his troubles. April 14th, 1943 would house the next attempt, where Floyd Hamilton, Fred Hunter, Harold Brest, and James Borman took hostage Captain Weinhold and a guard in the mat shop, using a plank as a bridge between the window and the fence. They climbed down to the other side and entered the water when Captain Weinhold alerted guards, who in turn opened fire. Fred and Harold were apprehended, James was killed by gunfire, his body sinking to the water, and Floyd, additionally, was declared dead. Awkwardly, though, a few days later, very much alive, Floyd wandered back and was captured and, of course, apprehended. Halfway done now, attempt number 8 would take place on August 7th, 1943, when Huron Ted Walters slipped away from his post on laundry and climbed the fence to get to the shoreline. Painfully, Ted would fall during the attempt and injure his spine. He was able to get to the water, but with his newly acquired back injury, it prevented him from getting anywhere. And without much resistance, he was caught by guards and sent to solitary confinement. John Giles, whose job on the island was to handle incoming shipments of dirty laundry to be cleaned by inmates and sent back, had been collecting over time pieces of clothing he'd hidden. On July 31st, 1945, having amassed an entire technical sergeant uniform, donned his disguise, and entered the Cokes, thinking it would be going back to San Francisco. An incorrect guess. By the time the boat landed at its actual destination, Angel Island, John had been discovered missing, and the jig was up. He was met by correctional officers, who quietly returned him to Alcatraz. Here's a pretty big one. On May 2nd, in 1946, Bernard Coy, along with fellow prisoners Clarence Carnes, Mirren Thompson, Marvin Hubbard, and previous escape perpetrators Joe Kretzer and Sam Shockley, distracted, jumped, and beat William Miller, the guard on duty, to steal his keys. Having access to the cells, the weapons from the armory, and more, the prisoners were now in a position of control. Very quickly, the attempt was found out, and what followed was essentially a 2-day standoff. Hostages were taken, and shots from both sides were fired over the 2-day period. While Sam, Clarence, and Mirren eventually returned to their cells, Joe, Marvin, and Bernard all decided they have no intention of going back alive. By the time the dust had settled on early morning, May 4th, Joe, Marvin, and Bernard's bodies were what remained of them, killed in what would be known as the Battle of Alcatraz. Along with the 3 convicts, 2 prison guards were killed and over a dozen more wounded. For their participation in the escape attempt turned violent blast out, Sam Shockley, Mirren Thompson, and Clarence Carnes all stood trial for the events. Sam and Mirren sentenced to be executed via gas chamber, and Clarence, who was just 19 at the time, was awarded his second life sentence. This specific attempt would rattle the entire staff, and you would see a dramatic upturn in security and firepower. So much so that there would be a 10-year gap between this attempt and the next one. The aforementioned 10-year gap would be ended on July 23rd, 1956, when Floyd Wilson, who worked on the dock, slipped away from his post. However, with no actual plans of escape, all he could do was hide amongst the rocks for several hours, after which Floyd, cold and freezing, was found and surrendered without any issues. September 29th, 1958 would serve as the next time somebody would put into action a plan, when Aaron Burgett and Clyde Johnson, while on garbage duty, assaulted and tied up prison guard Harold Miller. They made it to the shore and tried to swim for San Francisco, but to no avail. Clyde wouldn't get far before giving up and allowing himself to be recaptured, and while it seemed like Aaron might have made it, he disappeared, his body washing up on the shore 2 weeks later. Here's another big one. In fact, this is the one that most people think of when they think of an Alcatraz escape. John and Clarence Angan, along with Frank Morris, would put, with months of preparation in place, the most grand of schemes. The 3 men and co-conspirator Alan West had used metal spoons, discarded saw blades, and vacuum motor-turned drill to chip away at the concrete nightly, the noise drowned out by what would be known as music hour, when all the inmates would simultaneously play instruments allocated to them. Once a gap in their cells were big enough to get through, they were able to hide their work, with painted cardboard coverings to hide the vents, and dummy heads via papier-mâché-like means as to not alert guards to their disappearance. Behind their cells in the utility corridor, they were able to put together a makeshift workshop using stolen raincoats to fashion life preservers, as well as a 6 by 14-foot raft. Finally, they secured a path to freedom and waited for the right time to set everything in motion. On the night of June 11th, 1962, they set their plan into action. However, without 4th man Alan West, who struggled getting his body through the hole he had carved, eventually giving up and returning to bed. That's gotta suck. From the utility corridor, they were able to make their way to the roof, descending the fortress's blind spot, where they inflated their raft and launched it to Angel Island, 2 miles away. Once the escape was discovered the next morning, a huge search attempt commenced, though it only brought the discovery of a paddle, a wallet filled with the Anglin's contacts, shreds of raincoat materials, and a deflated life jacket. No human remains were ever discovered in connection with the escape attempt, and while the FBI surmised they most likely drowned, a good argument could be made on the contrary. The fact of the matter is, too much of this remains unknown, and even with Alan West's extensive testimony, let's be real here. We probably never will know what happened once their boat hit the water. But anyway, let's move on to the final entry. Finally, on December 16th, 1962, John Paul Scott and Darrell Lee Parker, having used string covered in kitchen cleaner to saw through the bars of a kitchen window, escaped through the window. They also had, over time, made handmade flotation devices They made it to the water and started to swim. Daryl took a breather on a small group of rocks off the coast, where he was shortly discovered. However, Scott, being pulled by the current, actually made it to Fort Point under the Golden Gate Bridge, and likely would have gotten away. However, suffering from hypothermia and shock, he wasn't going anywhere. He was discovered by teenagers who alerted officials to his presence, and he was taken to a hospital, where after treatment, he was swiftly sent back to the penitentiary. This would be the final logged escape attempt, as Alcatraz would be shut down a mere months later due to structural problems brought to light through the latter attempts, along with the astronomical costs associated with keeping the facility running. The legacy of the prison stays in the public eye even nowadays. Such was the unmatched uniqueness of the situation the prisoners found themselves in and the uniqueness of the actual building itself. The escape attempts as well have been adapted to movies several times. I hope the past 15 minutes or so has educated you on some of the lesser known entries and maybe just gave you a little bit of trivia that you can talk to your friends with. If you ever have any suggestions on what you'd like me to cover on these episodes, that's what the comment section is for. Thank you. I appreciate you watching the past 15 minutes or so, and I hope you have a wonderful day.